folks that may not know me, my name is John Landman. Currently I'm the president-elect of the International Association for the Cognitive and Evolutionary Sciences of Religion, which is the organization hosting this event. And our goal with the events is to, in this COVID era, to reach out more to members and to have community in the midst of not having conferences. And we thought, what better way to get this going than with Claire's new book on the introduction to the cognitive science of religion, which is providing a valuable service for the field, updating it from previous introductions. So Claire did her PhD here at Queen's University Belfast. She also worked at Oxford. She worked at a number of other places that I've bumped into her over the years. And Claire's been a mainstay of our field for quite some time. Does a lot of particular work on karma, does work on grief, does work across a number of domains, but also is really great at systemizing work in the field, which is what is happening in this book, and which I'm imagining we're going to hear more about today. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire so you hear more from her than you do me, but welcome everyone. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, John. And just so you know, John was just asked to give that introduction on the spot. And I got to say, your memory about where I've been is a little bit distant. All right, so I'm going to mute you all now so this doesn't happen. Okay, you should all now be muted. All right, so let's get started. Thank you all for showing up on a Friday to come and hear me summarize this subdiscipline and also summarize my book. It's not easy to summarize an entire book in 45 minutes, but you know what? I'm going to do the best that I can. So let's begin. All right. Okay, so the title of this talk is the same title as the book, An Introduction to the Cognitive Science of Religion, Connecting Evolution, Brain, Cognition, and Culture. To give a talk overview, I'm going to give a brief introduction, talk about the history, aims, and methods of the field, then the implications, and finally a conclusion. So let's begin with the introduction. There are four main questions that we are going to consider. The first question is, what is the cognitive science of religion? Now, in my experience, students, especially newcomers, find this term quite daunting, but when you break it down, it's actually pretty straightforward. Let's take a minute and think about what is cognition, right? Thinking, representation, memory, all that good stuff. So we're looking at how people think about, represent, process, distort information. Science, well, we could spend the next 10 years talking about what science is, but let's just talk about the scientific method for now, right? Observing, analyzing, predicting, and explaining the world. And now we come to the third, which is quite difficult to define succinctly, religion. And let's just use a folk concept of religion for now. So thinking about ideas, beliefs, practices that are in response to deities, principles of the world, causal explanations, all that good stuff, faith, whatever it is that you think religion is for now, let's include it. So putting it all together then, we have cognitive, so how the mind, oh, John said the slide is stuck on question 1. Yes, we are in question 1, John, but thank you for that. What is CSR? So looking at how the human mind, let me use this pen so that it's clear what we're on, how the human mind in conjunction with the scientific method explains religion. And John, can you just confirm with me that we're on question 2 now? You can verbally confirm. Okay. All right. Bear with me, I have to unlaser pointer myself and check. Yep, okay, good. All right, thanks, John. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me get the laser pointer. What questions does CSR address? So let's just discuss 4 of the many questions that we discuss. How did religion come about? Why is religion so prevalent around the world? What makes certain kinds of religious ideas and practices successful in spreading as compared to others? And what are the effects of religious practices on participants? Now, one thing I will say about these questions is that they're big, right? They're huge questions. And CSR does address smaller, more specific types of questions about particular traditions, but more generally, we discuss these big questions and these questions that are extremely important. Here's the third question of the four. What's the main goal of CSR? Well, the aim of CSR, as I interpret it, is to connect four components of human nature. One is evolution, brain, cognition, and culture. And that's why the subtitle of the book is The Cognitive Science of Religion, Connecting Evolution, Brain, Cognition, and Culture. And I think that when we do this, we can really begin the process and continue the process of explaining religion. Now, notice I haven't said religion explained. Provocative book titles aside, we're not trying to completely explain religion, just like we're not trying to completely explain anything. Explaining is a process, constantly under revision and constantly updating. Now, this model on the left here, this is actually a little bit deceiving, because for those of you who are vested in the evolutionary sciences, you will know that evolution actually runs a gambit of all of these things. So we can have evolution of the brain, evolution in cognition, and evolution in culture. And so other folks in CSR would probably say that this depiction on the right is a little bit more accurate. And so that is to say, evolution is really the connecting node to connect the brain, culture, and cognition, and that these three together explain this phenomena called religion. Now, another question, the final one of the four questions, what explanations does this new subfield provide? What do we explain? There's many different ways in which I could show you this, but I think one of the simplest is based on Tinberg's question. If you don't know what these questions are, you've never heard of Tinberg, you don't need to. But this gives us a kind of good guide to a kind of satisfactory explanation. So let's take the example of rituals. And here in the right, as you can see, I love this picture. This would actually denote the ontogeny, question 2. So we could ask, how does ritual behavior develop in individuals, right? Learned behavior. We could ask, what are the mechanisms underlying ritual, right? Then we could also ask, what is the evolutionary history of ritual? And we could ask, what are the functions of ritual? So this is just a neat way to kind of carve up systematically the different kinds of questions that we can ask in order to provide a satisfactory explanation of ritual, and I guess more broadly, a satisfactory explanation of religion. However, I should say that we're not trying to chunk apart the study of religion or ritual in the sense that these different questions and their corresponding methods, right, are complementary and interacting. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look on the left. This is the level of influence, all of the factors that influence one another. And I've chunked this into 3 different kinds of explanations. So you can have a biological explanation, let's say for ritual behavior, where you would look at things like what's happening neurochemically, physiologically, when someone performs a ritual. You could also look at the psychology in that ritual. So what kind of explanations is the person generating about the performance of their behavior in that context? And you can also look at social and cultural explanations of this ritual phenomena. So what is it about that particular environment that gives rise to those specific kinds of practices? What is it about the social fabric and the social makeup and socialization in that culture that kind of emphasizes and reinforce certain ways of behavior, right, in the ritual context. And the reason I'm saying that these are complementary and interacting is that they all influence each other. So I don't want to give you the impression that by saying we're looking at biological questions or we're looking at a social and cultural explanation, that these are necessarily distinct and that they don't come back together and interact one another. Really, the aim is to look at them in isolation, to bring them together, and then look at how they interact and look at also convergent properties. Okay. So let's look at an example. In this example, we're going to look at the social functions of rituals. And I'm going to hand it over to a colleague of mine who may be actually in this Zoom. And his name is Dimitris Egalitas. And Dimitris does work on the social functions of rituals. One thing I really want to make clear is that the cognitive science of religion isn't there to replace previous intellectual insights and remarkable work by social scientists, but it's there to complement them, to add more about what's known about the human mind, to use scientific methods, and also to kind of try to measure different types of levels of interaction, like I just said, to produce a better explanation of religion, and in this case, ritual. So in this example I'm going to show you, you're going to listen to my colleague, Demetrius, here on the left, talk about fire walking rituals in a village in Spain. And his work, for those of the social scientists in the audience, builds upon the insights of Durkheim and also, of course, Malinowski, who talked about the function of rituals for the individual and the function of rituals for the group. So let's turn it over to him. So I'm going to forward it on a little. Turn up the voice.
Hello, everyone. Just last week in this village throughout the year. But when I did what anthropologists do, asking people why they perform these rituals, the most common answer is, I don't know. That's what we do. Our fathers have done this, our grandfathers have done this, and their grandfathers before them. So this is just our tradition. But they also refer to a sense of identity. These rituals are fundamental to their personal and their collective identity. Without this fire-walking ritual, we wouldn't be who we are. San Pedro, our village, would never be San Pedro without this tradition. And anthropologists have known this effect of ritual in building identities for many years. Emil Durkheim described a phenomenon that he called collective effervescence, an ecstatic feeling of excitement and togetherness that people feel when they get together to perform highly arousing events. And at some level, we've all felt this feeling, whether when dancing on the dance floor with others or chanting in a football stadium with 30,000 people who share the same ideology as we do. But how can we measure this collective effervescence? How do we define even this vague concept? And how can we measure togetherness? In a study that my team and I conducted at this village, we used heart rate monitors to measure people's physiological responses to this ritual. And what we found was that there was an astonishing degree of synchronicity in their heart rates, although their bodies were doing entirely different things. These people are not performing the fire walk at the same time. While some of them are walking on fire, others are sitting down, standing up, or merely watching. We found that there was a tremendous degree of emotional alignment among community members, which extended beyond the active performers, even to the spectators who were merely watching. So for the first time, we're able to measure collective effervescence. We're able to measure this togetherness literally in people's hearts. But how does this actually translate into behavior? In the Kabaddi ritual of Mauritius, devotees engage in these painful activities all day until they reach the temple of Murugan. And then they will have to carry their burden 242 steps up the hill to offer it to the Lord Murugan. So we wanted to examine how this ritual would affect pro-social behaviors by looking at how much money people were willing to donate at a charity after performing this ritual compared to other rituals. So after their participation in different types of rituals, we invited these people to fill out some questionnaires discussing their experience about how painful this ritual was. And at the end of those questionnaires, we thanked them for participating. We paid them 200 rupees. And we told them they were free to go. 200 rupees in this context is a substantial amount of money. It's about 3 days' salary of an unskilled worker. And a few meters later, somebody stopped them, a local assistant, and asked them if they were willing to make a donation to a local charity. So we took those donations as a measure of pro-social behavior. And we saw that after performing a collective prayer, which is a low-key, more mundane ritual, people were significantly more likely to make a donation to this charity. But after taking part in the painful ritual, they were 3 times more likely to donate money.
So I'm going to stop it there, and I do highly recommend, if you're interested in that video, that you check it out. It's on TED Talks. So the key things to point out there about that particular research is that, again, it's showcasing these complementary and interacting levels of analysis, so building upon the work of social anthropologists and sociologists and other social scientists before him. Demetrius did not disregard their work. He basically looked at the underlying mechanisms, right? What's mediating the interaction between the ritual and the effect? What is the effect, and can we measure it? And how can we measure that effect on prosociality? That was the money donation. And also looking at physiological arousal and heart rate specifically, and how it changes throughout the ritual and the relationship between heart rates amongst people in the audience. So again, complementary and interacting levels of analyses and really quantifying the study of ritual. All right, let's move on. So let's look at the history of this sub-discipline. So I'm going to start with a story. It's not quite a fairy tale. We will see how it ends. But it begins with a group of scholars on the right who were dissatisfied with current trends and assumptions in the cultural studies about religion. For those psychologists and behavioral scientists, you'll know that around the 1950s, there was a cognitive revolution, right? A revolution in the social sciences, and specifically discontent about the behavioral sciences. Behavioral sciences basically claimed that there was an input and an output, and really nothing in between. So to put it in a very simple way, there was not a lot going on in between the ears. And around the 1990s, so sometime later, there was a group of scholars who were independently working on research on the study of religion. And they all got together and kind of discuss their dissatisfaction with assumptions in cultural studies about religion in particular. So I like to think of it as a huge revolution in the 1950s against the behavioral sciences, and then this kind of cognitive science of religion in another revolution, a smaller revolution, against assumptions in the cultural studies about religion. And they both have similar assumptions, and they both have similar points of discontent. So what on earth am I talking about? What assumptions in the cultural studies about religion were these scholars not happy with? Here's what I think is a simplistic but pretty accurate representation of how religion was being explained around the 1990s when this approach began. Culture. Right? Culture. So culture was kind of the key to explaining religion. And here is what I've shown you previously, which is what I think the aim of cognitive science of religion is in order to explain religion. So yes, of course, culture is here. Culture is important. Culture is integral to the study of religion. But also there is evolutionary processes, the human brain, and cognitive processes, and current models and explanatory models of religion around the 1990s really focused only on culture. So they're missing at least 3/4 of the explanation. And this really led to a lot of dissatisfaction at the time. Now I'm going to go a little bit more specific, and I'm going to run through this quite quickly. The first 3 on the right are really theoretical issues that these scholars had with current assumptions in cultural studies. And on the left, this is more methodological consequences of those assumptions. So the first assumption that these scholars got together and said, this really does not make sense. This doesn't help us explain religion. Postmodernism. Cultures are inherently different, and if they're inherently different, you can't capture them, right? Extreme cultural relativism. Cultural relativism in moderate form is great, and a lot of cognitive scientists of religion uphold it, as do I. But in the extreme version, which was really common at that time, the claim was that behavior can only be understood in light of a particular culture. And the third principle that these scholars did not agree with was that human behavior is exclusively determined by culture. This brought 3 related consequences. Number 4, If religion cannot be explained, it can only be interpreted. And so the role of social scientists is to discover hidden meaning via symbols, right? Semiotic turtles upon turtles, interpretation, infinite regression, infinitum, right? That was the key method around the 1990s. And it led naturally to textual analyses, right? This became the method of choice in religious studies departments to interpret cultures in as much detail by reading what was written down. And the sixth, if religion is unique and cannot be reduced to anything other than itself, then religion cannot be studied like any other human phenomena. It is something unique, it is something special, and it is something above and beyond social scientific research. And so what this really led to, I think, one unfortunate consequence of this approach was that religious studies departments around the United States and beyond were really focused on documenting diversity. And so actually you'll see here that what this amounted to was not to explain religion. In fact, these scholars would have said that explaining religion isn't even possible, but all you can do is interpret religion. And so what that does is they documented endless diversity. And so showcasing the differences in religion, and actually this is a common facet of many religious studies departments today, where you take a course on Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, the Big Five, and you learn from that expert who knows all the special intricacies of that tradition, why it's special, why it's unique, and why it's different. Less is really known about what makes these aspects similar. And so Bob Macaulay and Tom Lawson, who were two really of the forefathers of this subdiscipline, made the analogy like this. Yes, of course, there are important differences in religious traditions, just like there are important differences in the study of language. However, many of these differences, not all, but many, are superficial, surface level differences. And what if, in addition to documenting the diversity, we're also able to look at the constraints within which that diversity takes place? If we strip away, for example, as an analogy, some of the differences in language, we can see that there are, Chomsky proposed this, there are common underlying structures that are easily acquired by human beings, right? So in sum, can't we, while holding the differences constant, look at the similarities in religious traditions? And so let's look at the aims. There are three main aims that I'm going to talk about in this talk. So the first is to explain the emergence and spread of religion. Now, John Landman, I'm going to call upon you because I'm going to ask people to type in the chat the answer to a question. Let's imagine that we are going to explain the spread of the coronavirus, and you and I are in a team, a scientific team. And here on the left depicts all of the information that we have. We have the scientific method, and we have information on the spread, where it spreads. But there's one thing in this picture that is missing that we don't have. And I wonder, can you guess for me in the chat? And I wonder, John, if you could read out some of the responses. So if we're going to explain how the coronavirus spreads, looking at the mechanisms, looking at why it spreads some places and why it doesn't spread others, and we know we have the scientific method looking at the virus, what's missing from this picture? Can anyone guess in the chat? Okay, yes, this is an epidemiological. So John's answer is, can you unmute me, Claire? Yes, John, I can unmute you. I can see the chat for now, so we're good. So epidemiological studies, Andrew, you're quite right. This is an epidemiological study. And in order to look at the epidemiology, what do you need? There's one thing that's missing. You have scientists, you have the virus, but what don't you have in this picture? Does this virus spread? Thank you, Ron Davidson. You have won a gold star today. You were always my favorite. All right. So John says we don't have, Ron says we don't have the infected individuals. Right. We don't have the host. We don't have any information on the host. We have the virus and we have the distribution, and we have the scientific method, but we don't have the host of the virus. And Mathold also says how people interact with each other and spread the virus. Absolutely correct, correct, correct. So let me just get rid of this chat so I can, oops. Yeah, so this is what we're missing. We're missing how the human body stores the virus and what happens in the interaction of the virus. And, you know, we also don't have how individuals interact with each other and how this spreads the virus, because of course, this determines the spread. That's why we have things like social distancing guidelines and the wearing of masks. And so this is really just an analogy to help explain how and why looking at cultural studies of religion, if we're going to explain how and why religion emerges and how it spreads, which is one of the aims of the cognitive science of religion, we really need to know about the host. We need to know about how the human mind processes information and how we think and represent religion. And so the second aim of the cognitive science of religion is to draw upon recent research and methods in the cognitive sciences. Now, this is often emphasized in cognitive science of religion accounts because there was such a dearth of it in the emergence of, in cultural studies in religion, right? So we really emphasize this and drive this home. And these pictures just represent some of these. So you can see here from the top left, the input and output, that we're not adopting this black box method, right? So we have input and we have cognitive processing, and then we have the output. We also have socialization, and socialization is a huge role to play in how religious ideas are spread and successful. And evolutionary scientists often talk about the human mind much like a Swiss Army knife, where we come pre-prepared or predisposed to represent certain kinds of things in the world swiftly, right? And without much reflection. Okay, so let's look at another example. So what on earth do I mean by current research in cognitive sciences? Well, let's think about how people across cultures and domains explain misfortune by drawing upon research in the cognitive sciences. Now, Christine Laguerre and her colleagues have done research showing that these kinds of explanations, the coexistence of natural and supernatural explanations, are prevalent across different cultural contexts, looking at domains like illness, misfortune, death, etc. And so what's important about this example to note is that even though I'm providing you an example of her research in one context, it also applies to others. Just to put this in context, a lot of folks, scholars in this science and religion, talk about whether or not science and religion are compatible. And my colleague and friend, I see he's on this, Bob Macaulay, could explain this in much more depth than I. But let's just say that there's a lot of discussion and disagreement about whether or not science and religion are conflicting, or there's another way to integrate them. Cognitive science of religion scholars think that's interesting. What they're really interested in is how ordinary people think, right? Because that really impacts beliefs, behaviors, and practices. So do ordinary people across the world in different contexts, in certain domains like illness, death, other forms of misfortune, represent science and religion as conflicting, or do they represent them as somehow integrated in how they explain, how they provide causal explanations? So again, to hit home the point that cognitive scientists of religion are really building upon the insights of their intellectual predecessors. On the left, we have Christine. The middle is the representation of HIV. And on the right, we have Sir Evans Pritchard. And the anthropologists and social scientists among you long know, and we all know, Anthropology 101, Evans Pritchard did remarkable work with the Noor. And he actually suggested that people in different contexts, well, it's specifically the context that he was looking at, seem to integrate natural explanations of the world, like termites are eating the wood, and supernatural explanations of the world, like people who were sitting underneath that structure at that particular time were the subject of misfortune because they were bewitched. So let's take a look at Christine's work and see how she updates and advances this research.
The first cross-cultural research that I did was in South Africa. And I'd studied abroad in South Africa for a year as an undergraduate. And you really can't spend any time in probably any part of sub-Saharan Africa without noticing or being affected by the impact of HIV and AIDS in these communities. And I spent a lot of time working with children who'd been orphaned by AIDS, and became very curious about AIDS education programs. And I mean, much of the world has kind of moved on from this, but this disease has truly decimated the lives of millions and millions of people. So I wanted to figure out how to do some research that would be productive. And one of the things that I found astonishing in doing more research about this is that there was almost no research on how local populations think about the illness. What do they think causes it? What kinds of indigenous and local belief systems do they use to interpret this illness? So AIDS is relatively new in these communities, but misfortune is not, illness is not. There are local belief systems to explain all manner of misfortune. Witchcraft in this context would be the most salient. And so I was interested in how people bring witchcraft explanations to bear to understand AIDS, but also how they reconcile it with this huge amount of information that's now available, Western biomedical interpretations or explanations for what causes AIDS. So how do you integrate a germ theory with witchcraft? How does that work? Well, it turns out from the perspective of public health, many scientists have viewed this as impossibly inconsistent and incompatible, that there's no way that witchcraft causes AIDS from a scientific perspective, and of course that's true, but that in fact the use of witchcraft to explain AIDS was counterproductive and was doing damage. And so I did some research I started out with ethnography, and it's quite an extensive amount of ethnography, witchcraft is a very contextually based belief system. You really have to get the nuances of the belief system right to study this. So I started out with ethnography, and then I did some experimental research to look at how people integrated witchcraft and biomedical explanations for AIDS. And sure enough, I found that they're not psychologically incompatible whatsoever. And in fact, they're applied to explain multiple levels of causality. So witchcraft is most often used to explain the kind of distal cause, the why me, why was I in the path of that person at that particular time, where the germ theory or the AIDS virus is used as a proximate mechanism. So then people aren't viewing these as inconsistent necessarily at all, but they rather integrate their belief systems in some ways very psychologically sophisticated ways. So
that seems to imply very different public health in terms of outreach strategies.
Absolutely.
Very different prescriptions, right?
Absolutely. And I think the key is people are deeply pragmatic, that in a context where there is insufficient access to resources to treat the illness, it's not that people are appealing to witchcraft and explanations exclusively and denying access to antiretrovirals or whatever the case is. They're pragmatic, but in the absence of sufficient treatments, people seek out a great variety of other options. First cross-cultural research.
There's so much that I could say about this research, but I just want to point out a few things to help contextualize Christine Laguerre's research with with what we've talked about so far. So one aspect, as you can see, is the multi-methods that she's using. So on the one hand, she's doing detailed ethnography, and on the other hand, building upon this and then doing experiments and quasi-experimental studies. And also what she didn't discuss, but other research and other domains of misfortune around the world using the same kinds of methodologies. And what I think that there's two implications of this. One is that she's talking about how important it is that you get the nuances right of contextually based belief systems. So that requires great ethnographic skills. But on the other hand, in addition to that, because misfortune is something that happens to humans cross-culturally, we can also see that there are general patterns of reasoning about natural and supernatural causes when it comes to misfortune. And so the second point really that I think is important to think through about that example is how this kind of research in the cognitive science of religion really enhances religious tolerance and really enhances cultural competency when you can see that explaining misfortune using natural and supernatural explanations is not something that they do over there, it's something that we do over here also, whether it's, you know, the mechanism is witchcraft, God, karma, etc. We are all part of the same, we all pull from the same suite of psychological dispositions to explain misfortune. All right, who's ready for something fun? So what I want you to do is I want you to put your thumb up if you believe in ghosts. First thing that comes to your mind. I just want you to, right, okay, and I'm gonna have a brief count. Okay, so you can put your thumbs down. All right. The next question I want to ask you is, this is called the Château de Trézon in France, and it is allegedly haunted by a young woman who is buried alive there. Almost everyone who stays there reports hearing her in the middle of the night. I want you to put your thumb up if you would volunteer to stay there alone for a night, and be honest. Okay. All right, so what that example does is basically just demonstrates that what we say we believe is not always an accurate predictor of our behavior, right? And we need other ways to kind of tackle what guides our behavior. And I do notice a pattern in this, that people with kids, especially young children, do tend to volunteer to go stay here. I think they're weighing up the pros and cons of having a break during COVID. All right, but by and large, you know, if beliefs perfectly aligned with our behaviors, you would expect the same number of participants in this study right now to say that if they believed in ghosts, they would not stay there. And if they didn't believe in ghosts, they would. But by and large, of course, more people say they would not stay there, even if they do not believe in ghosts. And so let's talk a little bit more about this and elaborate. So another example of how cognitive science of religion uses updated theories and methods about the human mind is this dual process model of the mind. The dual process model of the mind is the idea that there are different kinds of processes that we use. So on the one hand, you have intuitive processes. These are quick, automatic, and implicit. So if I was to take this coffee cup and drop it, you would understand, and you would actually understand from a very young age, without much explicit indoctrination, that it would fall to the ground. This is based on an intuitive idea about folk physics. Likewise, if you were to go and stay in Le Château de Trézon and you heard a noise and at 2 a.m. in the morning, I'm going to guess that you would be extremely frightened, right? That is an intuitive response that's not necessarily based on a belief. Okay, this can be contrasted or juxtaposed to a reflective process. And this is number 2 on this diagram here. In contrast to intuitive processes, these are slow, deliberate, and explicit, and they form propositional beliefs. So if I asked you, do you believe in ghosts? This is a kind of reflective question. If you jump at things that go bump in the night, this is more of an intuitive response based on an intuitive process, based on your evolutionary makeup that is kind of evolved in this context to keep you safe and to keep you away from predators. If there's a chance that there is a predator in the environment, your cognitive system better ought to be able to detect it, right? Because it enhances your survival. And so cognitive scientists of religion use this dual process of the mind to help explain and pinpoint the spread of religious ideas and beliefs. So let's take the first one. Cognitive scientists of religion are interested in intuitive processes because they help tell us the role of the human mind in enforcing religious ideas and beliefs. Reflective processes are also of interest. These are more propositional beliefs because they help explain how culture and socialization and reinforcement interacts with our intuitive ideas to give rise to beliefs. So in the cognitive science of religion model, belief is really a meta-representational state, right? It's the proposition that I believe in X, Y, and Z. And these both are important in order to understand religious beliefs. Now, before cognitive scientists of religion, and indeed a lot of psychologists of religion, most in the study of religion are focused on two reflective processes, propositional beliefs. So an additional benefit of CSR is greater explanatory power by combining what is known about these two systems. If you are completely lost at this point, let me try to elaborate a little. So let's look at this diagram. Let's explain, just like we talked about COVID-19, the transmission potential of diseases through an epidemiological model. Let's explain the transmission potential of religious ideas. So these are different combinations that I'm going to talk you through that give rise to beliefs. So the first is based on intuitive ideas, things that go bump in the night. When those intuitive ideas are combined with even moderate and in some cases minimal cognitive elaboration. So you're in a setting where they talk about ghosts. As a child, you watch ghost videos, right? Not the really scary kind. I'm thinking more like Casper. You watch movies and TV shows and you discuss, and ideas about ghosts are just kind of moderately elaborated upon, even to a small extent. And then you have moderate cultural supports. People around you believe in ghosts and, it's encouraged. Well, this gives rise to beliefs, right? Beliefs in ghosts. Now, let's take something that is counter to an intuitive idea, right? So now let's take the idea that there is a non-permanent, non-enduring self. And this is prominent in some Buddhist doctrines and Buddhist folk concepts, right? So the idea that you are a permanent, enduring person from one moment to the next and from one day to the next is a folk belief, right? And it serves a very important purpose and a function, and it's intuitive. The idea that you're here now and you're here in a minute later. A counterintuitive idea from the example of Buddhism is that there is no permanent, enduring self. So this is not intuitive, this is counterintuitive in this context. Now, this kind of idea, in order to take off, in contrast to the intuitive idea, which requires moderate, even minimal cognitive elaboration, this requires extensive rehearsal and cognitive elaboration, repetition, 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 right? Just like those Catholic mass doctrines that you have to recite, or learning Latin, or Buddhist studying Vedic traditions in scriptures in order to understand this idea of non-atom, right? Extensive rehearsal and cognitive elaboration. And more often than not, it probably requires extensive cultural support. So everyone in the community accepts this belief, you're socialized into it, and it's supported. And it gives rise to also to beliefs. So of course, there's not only two different routes to religious ideas, but this is just an example of how understanding intuitive ideas versus counterintuitive ideas, or intuition and propositional beliefs, how there's different routes that those can take in order to form beliefs. So we're not saying that intuitive ideas only give rise to beliefs. We're saying that we really need to figure out scientifically how cognition interacts with culture to produce religion. And that's really important. So I'm going to say it again. We're really trying to understand how cognition interacts with culture to produce religion. Okay, all right. So another component looking at cultural science models is that we now have the ability to distinguish between popular, ordinary versions of religion and what it says in doctrine or dogma, or I guess religious leaders, what they espouse about the official belief systems. And so this really enables us to have, again, more explanatory power in how ordinary people tend to think and represent religion, as opposed to other approaches to the study of religion, and notably, as I said before, religious studies departments were really obsessed almost with documenting with textual analysis. So they were really looking at theological versions of religion. And cognitive science of religion, of course, is interested in both, but also makes this distinction. And I think this distinction is very helpful. So let's watch this video.
According to its canonical texts, Buddhism is...
Oh, my apologies. Right.
Religion. Rather, the Buddha is famously not supposed to be worshipped as a deity. Instead, the Buddha was just supposed to be a remarkable man who managed to escape the cycle of birth and rebirth by achieving the state of parinirvana. There's just one problem. That's not what most Buddhist practitioners actually believe. So today we're going to be doing some good old-fashioned debunking. And the first of our two debunking exercises concerns this idea of what's called theological incorrectness. What theological incorrectness is a deviance between religion as it appears in scripture and religion as people actually practice it on the ground. The modernist view of Buddhism as a non-theistic religion, one that's more rooted in a philosophical tradition of spiritual self-reliance, the one that's pervaded Western culture, partially because it's so consistent with post-Enlightenment values, also happens to be consistent with what's actually written in the Buddhist canon, but it's not what we would predict from a cognitive science-informed perspective of religion. And in this case, reality, at least as practiced by the vast majority of Buddhists, happens to be on the side of the psychology rather than on the side of the theology. Buddha is deified and prayed to, as if in some sense he was present and able to hear those prayers. To learn more about this idea of theological incorrectness, we're going to talk to Dr. Jason Sloan, who literally wrote the book on theological incorrectness. It was titled Theological Incorrectness.
Early on in the study of religion, the idea was that if you want to understand what religion was all about, you study texts. So you study the Bible, you study the Quran, you study the texts of the Asian religions. But starting in the 1960s and 70s, scholars realized that if you really want to understand religion, it's best to go study actual living religious people and talk to them and find out what they believe and do. And lo and behold, what we found out is that lived religion, or religion on the ground, as scholars describe it, is often quite different from religion in the books. We've discovered that there's a gap between what people ought to believe, what people actually believe, and what people ought to do and what people actually do. Playing off the notion of political incorrectness, theological incorrectness is the notion that oftentimes people have beliefs and do practices that are actually in violation of the theologies of their own traditions. And that's actually a pretty common phenomenon we find across cultures and across religions.
So again, just to reiterate, cognitive science of religion gives us greater explanatory power, because now we're not just studying theological doctrine, but we're also looking at what theological doctrine, what people claim to believe, and also how people react and how people reason when they're under cognitive constraint, like time pressure. Okay, so now we're at about 50 minutes. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through the next remaining slides quite quickly. And so we're almost there. The third aim of cognitive science of religion is to create a scientific understanding of belief and behavior. By labeling a range of phenomena as religious, scholars have really designated a package of ideas and behaviors as being related, right? So by saying that religion is X, Y, and Z, we are saying that, you know, we can break up religion according to these patterns, but actually that's an assumption that hasn't been systematically tested. The question remains, do religious traditions, or do how we break up groups into different categories, denote meaningful relationships between thoughts, behaviors, traditions, and institutions? And this is an open question. So one way to tackle this is to use the scientific method. And so here is a scientific classification of the plant kingdom based upon similar features. And this is a scientific method in the study of religion. So here's what we do. First, this is known as a fractionation method. We break down aspects that seem to recur across cultures. So for example, the idea that things happen for a reason, crop circles where they're put there by an agent in order to communicate something to you, that the body is separate from the mind, and that the mind or the soul continues after death, but that the body remains, ritual practices, all of these different components that recur across cultures. And then we break them down even further according to the underlying cognitive foundations that give rise to them. So what I just described actually were the cognitive foundations. The first point, please excuse me, were just the labels. So for example, beliefs in life after death, patterns, religious practices, and the psychological dispositions are belief that things happen for a reason, belief that the body and the mind are separate, and so on and so forth. So we're taking these aspects that seem to recur across traditions and across history and across cultures, and breaking them down, and then seeing what are the biases, what are the predispositions that form part of these constructs, right? So we're fractionating them. I don't have time to talk about this, but this is one of the cognitive biases known as promiscuous teleology. So it's work by Deborah Kellerman. In a nutshell, basically, she has found that there is a predisposition to think that things happen for a reason, right? This crop circle is there for a reason. You know, if you find a penny on the street, that happens to tell you something for a reason. So teleology is just this idea that things have a purpose, and that can be functional, but when it goes awry, it's promiscuous. And a lot of religious beliefs, and not just religious beliefs, really build upon this idea that there is a purpose. Your life has purpose, your life has meaning, the world was created for a purpose, etc. And so the third component of this is that recurrent ideas and practices like supernatural agents or belief that life has a purpose or that the world was created for a reason are underpinned by these intuitive beliefs, psychological propensities, such as anthropomorphism, or the idea that things are created for a reason, that are then reassembled in culturally particular ways. So here's a quick demonstration. Let's just say that this on the left and this on the right are two cultural traditions. Let's say A is Christianity and B is Buddhism. Or let's say A is a particular ritual in Christianity and B is a particular ritual in Buddhism. And let's take the red block and say that the red block represents the extent to which people think that meaning is important, that there is a purpose to the ritual, right? Well, then that's represented in the red here, and it's represented here. It can be centrally more important in some rituals than others, and in some traditions than others, but it can be reconfigured in different ways. And let's say yellow is belief in supernatural agents. And let's say in this ritual, it's not that important and it's not that central, but in this ritual it is. And all I'm doing here is trying to demonstrate using Lego blocks how these different psychological propensities can be used to build a bottom-up construction of religion rather than a top-down one, such as we've all heard, religion is X, religion is Y, religion is Z. Okay. So we also employ multi-methods to fit the problem. As the saying goes, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem is a nail. Contrary, cognitive scientists of religion also have a hammer, but look, they also have a huge repertoire of different methods in order to explain and predict religion. Here's some examples. Let's pick one or two. How do assumptions about speakers' charismatic abilities change how information is processed, right? Well, here, because of the nature of this question, we can use neuroscience and questionnaires. But let's look at another question, which looks at the psychological level of cognitive explanations. How do people represent spirit possession? Well, here, because it's in a particular context, first we do ethnography, and then we can run controlled experiments. And so the point of this is to say that different types of questions are best addressed by particular kinds of methods. But if the only method that you use is a hammer, and I guess the hammer would be in social sciences, primarily ethnographic research, which is valuable, we cognitive scientists of religion come together in teams with a whole repertoire of different kinds of toolkits. I don't have time to go into that, but we try to quantify the study of religion and look for patterns rather than simply descriptive accounts. We also promote interdisciplinarity, and it is important to note that there are different levels and degrees to which we can be interdisciplinary. I'm sure maybe some of you, my more seasoned colleagues, have the experience of working in an interdisciplinary team only to be bitterly disappointed. Cognitive scientists of religion try to promote the strongest and integrate the strongest form of interdisciplinarity. So team-based research paradigm, really looking at a huge scope of integration between fields like literature and neuroscience, who seem to have very different commitments and methods, bringing them together, and the type of integration. So rather than just borrowing ideas from each other, trying to integrate each other so that we influence theories and methods moving forward. Finally, let's look at the implications of this approach. First, I think that it will produce a better explanation of religion by connecting evolution, brain, cognition, and culture, and also looking at interacting and complementary levels of analyses using multi-methods and teamwork. It's a great formula. I think it will also put religious studies back on the map as a serious scholarly pursuit. And I love this drawing. As you can see, it says Catholic education, and of course, it's Catholic Mass, right? That's not what we do in religious studies, and especially not in the scientific study of religion and elsewhere. Third, and Liza Jarnefeld and I are actually writing a children's book right now because we believe that this is part and parcel of where cognitive science can really contribute to our society. In a diverse society, if we focus on the underlying similarities of religion, in addition to the differences, I believe that this can really enhance our tolerance for other religious traditions and cultural competency in general. The fourth is that I think by adopting this bottom-up, all-inclusive conceptualization of religion, we can now include the other traditions that are often forgotten. They're not included in the big five, and they're often relegated to lesser categories like superstitious, for example. And I've just given some examples there on the left. And finally, I think that this explains, looking at cognitive processes and how people integrate explanations of science and religion, why through changing circumstances, belief remains constant. And I really love this pictorial representation of this coexistence model. This is a doctor who has just performed surgery on a COVID patient and who has taken off one of his gloves and is praying in addition to his surgical expertise for their recovery. That's the end of my talk. Thank you so much. If you have any, if you want to do any further reading, you're welcome to consult my book. Thank you so much. All right. So let me stop the share and let me try to unmute you all. All right, so you can now unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. John, I'm going to ask you, could you facilitate some of the Q&As through the chat box? So
sure, Claire, I'm happy to do that. So I'll keep an eye on the chat, and also I'm going to try to spot where folks have raised their hand, and I'll try to field those questions for Claire. So yeah, it was a great job, Claire, with the timing. So we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. Claire, thank you so much for that presentation, an overview of your book, very timely, and also for added a few points. I haven't been able to read the whole book, only parts of it. So the points you made in the talk there filled out in some gaps for me. But I'm going to open it up to the floor for any questions for Claire on either her book or the presentation.
And I do want to actually add that there are some experts in the cognitive science of religion here, so you may not get off the hook. If there are any questions about that, I might defer to some of my colleagues.
So everybody stay on your toes. Oh, so we have a first question I see from Hannah. Oh, it's not, I'm sorry, it was my icon. See, I'm a Teams person and not a Zoom person.
I think Ron has a question. I see Ron's hand is up.
Ron has a question.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really, really enlightening talk, and I'm an outsider to this whole discipline, so I'm speaking from far outside. But it strikes me that, nationalism is another sort of a domain in which there seems to be a global, acceptance of this common sense framework way of looking at things, kind of analogously to religion. Is your cognitive approach flexible to sort of be useful to explaining other things than religion, like a kind of, beliefs more broadly, like nationalism or something like that?
Right. So I'm going to talk about an analogy that I found that I made reference to in the book, and then I'm going to invite Bob and also Armin, if you guys want to chime in, or anyone else in this field about nationalism specifically. I use the analogy in the book about race, right? And how I think race is not a scientifically biological concept. And in fact, the concept of race is detrimental to our understanding of other people. And really, it impedes the scientific study of biological differences and diversity. And so, of course, the biological study of differences is to look at these mechanisms and look at DNA and look at our ancestry. And so to me, that was akin to what we're trying to do in the cognitive science of religion, in the sense that, religious traditions can be detrimental because they place people in an other category, and they don't adequately always, even mostly, describe the differences. They describe a lot of surface level differences and historical differences, but they don't do justice to the psychological similarities that we have and the functions that many forms of religion serve. And so that struck me as a really interesting analogy, and also why we were kind of inspired to create this children's book, because, hey, if this is, if race is detrimental, the concept of race is detrimental to really scientifically understanding, then in some contexts, educating children and educating our students only on religious traditions and only on the differences can really contribute to religious intolerance. I wonder, does anyone else want to comment on Ron's specific point about nationalism? Yes, Armin and Bob. Armin? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question, Ron. One of the interesting things about the cognitive approach to the study of religion is that we are dealing with mechanisms that are universal human mechanisms and can be used to study any kind of cultural phenomena, including nationalism, politics, whatever, aesthetics. And so often it's a criticism of the cognitive science of religion that we are actually talking about mechanisms that don't necessarily have to do specifically with religion. But that's the power of the cognitive science approach.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I was just going to add that, remember, cognitive science of religion's roots are in cognitive science. And cognitive science is a discipline that's been out there now for more than 4 decades. And it addresses a wide range of cognition. Alas, one of the arguments we've tried to make is in the same way we've challenged some things that have gone on in conventional religious studies, to also challenge some things that have gone on conventionally in cognitive science, which is to say that although it tries to explain plenty of other aspects of human thought and behavior, it hadn't given much attention to religion. And that was simultaneously, while we were sort of responding to circumstances in the world of religious studies, we were responding to the world in cognitive science as well. Moreover, plenty of folks in religious studies, conventional religious studies, have seen analogies to things like nationalism or sports and sports enthusiasm, that sort of thing. even in the social sciences, secularization, and so on. Lots of other folks have seen those connections, but no one's ever sort of tried to weave a theoretical story that will make sense of all of that stuff. And to some extent, that's part of our project.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. John, do you want to field a few more?
Sure. No, thanks very much for your question, Ron, and for that input. So given that we have 10 minutes left, I wanted to move away from I've got some ideas there too, Ron, but I'm going to restrain myself. So we've got another couple of questions where I see hands. First, Russell, and then Ben. And then I think, Andrew, if you could raise your hand on your...
Hello.
So, Russell.
So thank you you provided us with your book early in my class with Dr. Chilcott, ISU. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciated reading it early. Was very grateful for that. So my big question was, the thing I found most interesting is the fact that you made the point that it seems that religion and morality co-evolved to promote pro-social behavior. And my question is that it seems like with religion and with morality potentially that sometimes they go awry and they cause heinous acts. They cause people to justify doing things that are completely amoral and completely, you think, contrary to pro-social development. What is the basis for that? Why is there this cognitive, almost evolutionary mishap that can occur with religion and with morality that causes it to almost be completely opposite of what you had said was the intended goal of them?
John, do you or does anyone else want to tackle that question? Anyone who works specifically on pro-sociality and morality and religion?
Would you like me to, Claire?
Yeah, sure.
Try to speak to that.
This to be more open discussion than I am the
Sure.
CSR guru.
No. Thanks for your question, Russell. So first, I think we want to make a distinction between normative claims about what we say is moral or immoral versus the science of how humans make moral judgments and how they behave, right? So I think we want to make that distinction. So if the claim is, or if the question is, why would something that seems to be about building groups and cooperation also result in, say, violence against people? So it's sort of, what is the issue there? I think one answer from evolutionary and cognitive sciences might be that when we think of pro-sociality in terms of human evolution, we're talking about a group-based species that were divided into two cultural groups, to where what might be incredibly pro-social for your in-group of people who share your norms and that you cooperate with for benefits and for your own and for their shared fitness, what might benefit that group would be at the detriment of a neighboring group. So there's actually a whole evolutionary force in the literature that we work with called cultural group selection, where certain types of rituals, beliefs, practices, they might allow one group to grow much quicker than another group and displace it. They might allow them to be very cooperative and just gain more from the environment, or they might bind them together so well that they can go to war with a neighboring group and survive that and thrive. And the cultural variance that would allow that might survive and thrive and grow more prevalent. So it's the case that religion is pro-social in the sense of kind of pro-groupish. Now, what we've seen in the rise with modern states is that idea is no longer a good idea in the eyes of modern states. You get the wars of religion, right? So a lot of what happened in Europe is to try to develop some set of international law where religious groups, religiously defined groups, were not warring with one another to the point where you were having real problems. So you started to have secular states, and you started to worry about religious loyalties being problematic and causing violence. And that's sort of where we are now. We're trying to marshal the pro-sociality of religion and turn it into universalism, right? And to take more pro-groupish and to expand the nature of the group. I don't know, does that help answer your question?
It does. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Okay. if I could then ask Vin for your question.
Cool. Let me just get it up. Hi, everyone. I'm Vin, and I just want to say thanks to Claire for your book and your presentation, and indirectly also Bob for writing your book, because that was the first book that I read that got me into this CSR. And also Valerie. Hi, Valerie. So I am coming from relatively obscure traditions. So I'm coming from, informed by my reading of like meta-science and post-humanist philosophical traditions. And I thought it might be fruitful to bring in some of their insights, especially with regard to beliefs about agency, because agency features quite a lot in CSR, especially with HADD, or hyperactive agency detection. And I was just wondering, like this panel of esteemed people, how agency is defined and conceptualized according to CSR. Because I feel like by extension, it, you know, there's all these implications about free will and morality as well that are tied up to it.
Bob, I think since he read your book first, and you were the person who got him into this mess. Which book was it that you read, by the way, Win?
The Naturalness of Religious Ideas, which made me so angry, and I read it out of spite. And then by the end of it, I was a convert. So.
The Naturalist of Religious Ideas is Pascal Boyer's book.
Oh, no. It was, that might have been,
okay.
I can't remember. It was one of those. I was reading a lot of books at that point, and one of them was Bob Macaulay, and there was also there was Pascal Boyer as well. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. That's okay. Yeah, agency. Boy, a long discussion of that. I partly, at least Lawson and I suggested that agent is a concept that's probably one for which humans have got some fairly strong dispositions to learn, and learn really early because they need to. Babies need to distinguish agents from other things in their environment, and actions from other events in their environment. Then there's a whole set of the whole body of research in cognitive psychology and cognitive science on sort of the features that help us to figure out which things in our environments are agents. I mean, they tend to be the ones that are animated and they move in irregular patterns and things like that. They don't just, as it were, superficially conform to Newtonian forces. They do other things as well. They move their hands around like I'm doing right at this moment. And then, of course, the point is that they, on the basis of at least some kind of fairly, I mean, I think theory of mind is itself a multi-layered, complex phenomenon. They're the things out there in the world that we typically attribute minds to, and therefore, because of their states of minds, I mean, they have goals and they have intentions and so on, and that informs these irregular motions that they carry out. But the long and the short of it is that at least Tom and I wanted to argue that there's some pretty fundamental equipment in there for this whole issue of representing these special kinds of things in the world and the kinds of things that they do in contrast to other events and occurrences that occur in our environments.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so
Someone
much.
commented, I think it was religion is natural and science is not. I think that's the book you're thinking of.
Yeah, that was probably it. I'm sorry, it was a long time ago. It was about 2 years ago, and I've been reading everyone's books. So naturally, you, Harvey, Pascal Boyer, I would have gotten all of them mixed up. But thank you so much for that.
Oh,
Well,
no
Ben,
problem.
we very much appreciate your enthusiasm and
Yeah, exactly.
for that question. So we're coming near to the end of our time. So I just want to take Andrew's question. I think that's going to be the last one we have time for today. So thanks, Andrew.
I feel honored to ask the last question. Claire, I wanted to ask about the dual foundations of the field, or dual origins, cognitive science on the one hand and religious studies on the other. Everybody tends to come from one or the other. So as someone raised in the cognitive sciences, I always feel a little amiss contributing to the cognitive science of religion, because I know there's this whole other area of research out there that I'm unfamiliar with. And I'm just wondering, what in religious studies do you think is critical for people in cognitive science to be considering when trying to contribute to this literature? And also there's the reverse question too, but maybe for my own personal benefit, I like to hear about the religious studies side that I should be more attentive to.
I can answer pragmatically, and then I'll hand it over to the others if they want to comment on based on their experience. Pragmatically, I think teamwork is the way forward. And I think that there are things about, there's nothing necessary or essential about the study of religion that you need to know before you engage in explaining religion. Likewise, I'm not sure that there is one or two or even three golden key facts or approaches that you need to know about the cognitive sciences in order to engage in the explanation of religion. I, in the book, adopt a really broad approach of who and who is not a cognitive scientist of religion. I think that as long as you are engaged in the study of the human mind in some level, and you are trying to explain something about religion, and you agree with some of these tenets, right, about the scientific approach, that you are a cognitive scientist of religion. I would consider you a cognitive scientist of religion. And in terms of feeling that there is a whole area of literature that you're not versed in, and that's the same with any topic, any cognitive approach, whether you're in cognitive science of sport, the cognitive science of weather prediction, right? You naturally would probably team up with weather prediction experts. And this is a silly example, but my, to that kind of uncertainty and confidence about being able to engage in these, in the cognitive science of religion, one, you're already in, because that's what you do. And two, there's no key fact or approach that you need to know. And three, I think teamwork really is the best way to facilitate, explaining religion. Does anyone else want to follow up? Armin.
I understand the problem. We that come from the study of religion often have the problem when we move into other sciences to find out what are the most important methods, what are the most important theories, how do I avoid making really stupid mistakes based on ignorance. And usually I go to reviews of review articles, guidebooks, encyclopedias, and those very same tools are found in religious studies. So the Encyclopedia of Religion and a whole bunch of other books are useful if you're looking for information from the history of religions or comparative religion on specific rituals or whatever it is that you're interested in.
And just to build on that, thank you, Armin, and also to wrap up, one thing I will say, that part of the reason that I wrote this introduction book was to empower people who consider themselves not versed in this or outsiders to look at the way of presenting the field of cognitive science of religion, to empower them to participate in this, because it's a team-based approach, it's interdisciplinary. And so based on those two premises, anyone should be able to engage and work in cognitive science of religion. For me, it's a very inclusive label. Humanities, social scientists, natural science scholars are all welcome on board. And one final point, if you have enjoyed this talk and you want to find out more about the cognitive science of religion, one way is to obviously get my book, and another way is to join the International Association for the Cognitive and Evolutionary Study of Religion. John, would you like to pronounce that, just so we're all sure how to pronounce it?
I think we finally settled on IACESR.
Okay.
Rather than IACESR, which sounded a bit phlegmy.
So if you Google IACESR, sorry, you will be taken to the website and you can join and become a member. And that's a way to keep up with all the fun stuff that we've got coming up. John, would you like to close out?
Sure. No, thanks so much, Claire, for that excellent presentation. We had great questions, and I'm really encouraged by the great turnout today to have, I think at the high point, we had 28 or 30 people on the call, which is great. And it's encouraging for us. We want to run more of these events. So we'll look to set those up in the future, so that even though we can't necessarily have our conference every year, we were really disappointed we couldn't have it last year in New Zealand. That these types of events will keep the community together, and hope to see you again very soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. This talk will be recorded and hosted on the website also at a later date if you want to revisit it. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. You've certainly earned it. Now that you know about the benefits of rituals, maybe you can participate in a few. This includes celebratory drinking, dancing, Zoom webinars, whatever makes you have fun. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.